I'm Stuart from the Shufflepack, and it's my privilege to be here presenting another Blues Talking in the series from the mighty Henry's Blues House. We're doing these kinds of things from isolation to try and keep the spirit alive of Henry's and keep the blues alive at a time when perhaps we need it more than other times. Although there's never really a time when you don't need the blues, as we're about to discover. So Jim asked me to put together a little talk about how to play the blues harmonica and a bit about the blues generally. So really, to tell you how to play the blues harmonica, it's quite simple. You suck and you blow. So thanks very much. And well, of course, it isn't that simple. I happen to have here a blues harmonica. This is a Hohner Marine Band, wrong side, Hohner Marine Band harmonica. And it was the first really popular, cheap, widely available harmonica in the southern states of America towards the end of the 19th century. It was actually built in 1896, or manufactured, it was launched in 1896. For the harmonica nerds among you probably know this anyway. As you can see, the comb, it's made of pear wood. It has sort of tin or so, I actually don't know what it is, chromium plated or whatever cover. And you have 10 holes and you have 3 musical scales on those 10 holes. And I'll see if I can get through one. Hang on a minute. That was close. I'm one of those harp players who can really get up to the top. It's just too noisy. It's not a very nice sound, really. So, and also I can't be bothered. But you probably heard, as I went through the bottom end, that I had to bend the note, and we'll come back to that later. But that's basically it. So you blow and you suck. And that's how you play the blues harmonica. At least it's how you play the harmonica. It's not how you play the blues harmonica. The blues harmonica you can only play if you have the blues. And that's how to play the blues. You got to have them. So how do you get the blues? Well, have you ever been in love? Have you ever not been in love? Have you ever lost your job? Have you ever got the best job you've always wanted? Have you got a mortgage? Do you pay tax? Do you have a family? Do you have a family? Anything can give you the blues. And that's because the blues is not about anything in particular. It's about who you are. That's why so many players who play the blues don't play the blues. They play it technically correctly. They've learnt how to play from a book, but they don't dig deep down within and play what's inside them, who they are, what shapes them, what upsets them, what makes them cry, what makes them laugh, what makes them shout with joy. All of that is in the blues. If anybody ever tells you that the blues is about misery and sadness, nah, it's there. It's got to be there. The blues for me, more than anything, is about power. It's about, this is who I am. I am not just another person in the mass. And as we'll talk in a moment, I'm not just a slave. I am an individual with my own things to say, my own feelings, my own experience of the world, and I'm going to pour it out through this. Amazing that you can do that, but that's what you can do. And other instruments, as we'll see in a moment. So we'll come into that technically, how you play the blues in a moment. But I think the first thing to do is perhaps give a bit of context and talk about some of the history of the blues. So as you probably know, intertwined with the story of the blues is the story of slavery in the southern states of America. It was really, slavery probably started around the 15th century, 1400 and something. Originally it was Portuguese slavers. They went looking for gold, but they found that they could sell people. And the first American slaves from the European slave trade or the American slave trade got to America in about 1619, allegedly, somewhere around that time, early 17th century. And it was a trade live for about 200 years, 250 years actually. And obviously went out, it was made illegal when the American Civil War came to an end. So it was 1865. And at that time, the laws were changed in the South and slaves were set free. But gradually after that, the southern states introduced what became known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a character in the minstrel shows, blackface minstrels, white people blacking up as minstrels. And there was a dance that Jim Crow did, and these laws became known as that because they were there to oppress black people in the southern states. And they introduced a system called sharecropping. So previously slaves worked on cotton plantations and other tobacco as well. And they were given, when they were set free, an acre of land. Don't quote me on this. Historically, I may be a bit loose, so I don't think I'm any kind of authority. This is what I've read in various books and can remember. I haven't really worked this out. But basically, sharecropping, you got given some land and some seed and a shack on the edge of the land, and you could grow some cotton. And at the end of the season, you would sell your cotton to the landowner. You had to pay rent on the land, and you were given everything you needed to live and grow the cotton. And then when you sold the cotton at the end of the season, that paid for all the expenses that you had incurred and the rent and everything else like that. And it was strange because every year at the end of the season, the money that the sharecroppers got for their cotton was never quite enough to cover the costs that they'd incurred. So they had to work another season. And the landowners took away the cotton and they sold it at a profit and so on. So sharecropping became a great way to perpetuate the idea that what were once slaves were now free men or free people, but working still the land, still providing the economic benefit to the landowners. So that was the background to the blues. But what you got in that sort of melting pot was a collision of traditions. So the slaves were brought over from mostly West Coast Africa, Northwest Coast, Senegambia, Angola, Congo, Ghana and Nigeria, those kinds of areas. They came across the Atlantic to the southern states, Jamestown in Virginia, New Orleans, places like that. And they were sold in the markets there. And what you had in places like New Orleans in particular was a real coming together. A city like New Orleans, you had French, the Acadians from Canada, you had the sort of Irish, European Americans. You have to remember that the United States was only in 1776. So, you know, you've still got all those people very, very new into this country. It's a very new country. There's lots of cultures all coming together at once. And into that melting pot comes the African culture. So you've got traditional European music, classical music. If you're sitting on a plantation of an evening, you might hear the respectable daughter of the plantation owner playing her lovely European classical music. Might be Bach, might be Brahms, whatever, or nice American folk songs, or indeed European folk songs. They're still singing the songs they brought with them when they emigrated from Europe to America. And of course, you'll have the French tradition coming in. You'll have accordions and all that kind of stuff in certain parts. So there's an English tradition, an Irish tradition, a French tradition, obviously the German classical and your Italian classical, all the different traditions. And then you, as a slave, have got your own tradition. And of course, each individual African country had its own kind of music, but you'll be bringing polyrhythms, the drumming that was either the language or just the rhythm of the dance, and then the instruments that they built. So they were gourds with stringed instruments, pipes fashioned from reeds and all kinds of things. And you'll have a whole different tonal understanding of how music works. So you'll come into contact with the formal structures of European music and American music. And you'll bring with you the improvisation, the free scales, the different scales and the different rhythm patterns, polyrhythms they were called, where you've got multiple rhythms going on at once. And you'll bring that together with the Western music and something new happens. And that was where the blues and jazz kind of emerged from this new world of slaves, free people, everything. And the other factor that was a big part was religion. One of the reasons that slavery was found to be acceptable for a very long time before it was finally outlawed was because it was seen as an evangelism. The enslaved black people in the South were taught the Christian tradition, and it was seen as an evangelical act of God to bring these people into the Christian family. So they were taught hymns and folk songs, spirituals, and they began to invent their own spirituals as new generations were born in slavery, and their mastery of the English language grew greater. They were creating their own songs, and the spirituals that they sang were a very key part of the origination of the blues. Muddy Waters interviewed in a very good film called The Chicago Blues from the early 70s. Strange film, but it's really good insight into how the Chicago Blues evolved. You can see it on YouTube, I think. Asked about the blues, he said, well, you got to suffer. And he says, and you got to go to church. And you see the charismatic tradition of the church in that film, where they get happy. The preacher comes, you've seen it in the Blues Brothers actually, and he rouses them to a frenzy, the James Brown sequence in the first Blues Brothers film, and everybody's going woo, and there'll be ululation, speaking in tongues. You know, it was a mass hysteria thing. They energized the crowd, and of course the black African tradition was to dance and to sing and to get high on the oxygen that you're breathing in and all that kind of stuff. And that came into the Christian tradition. So if you've ever been to a Pentecostal church in the UK, you'll have experienced it. That cry, hallelujah, all that kind of stuff. It's all in there. It's all packed in. Classical music, church music, everything. So it's astonishing, really. It would have been astonishing if the blues hadn't happened, when you put it like that. So let's have a look at how the blues works. I'm not a piano player. I survived as a musician really by playing instruments that other people don't play. So not many people play piano when you start out playing rock music, as I did. So you'll always get a gig. And then when you realise that you're going to have to start getting good, the way you maintain a living is by having a PA system and singing, because not really many people want to sing. So I've managed to survive by singing and hauling gear, but I can get by. So I'll show you essentially the structure of the blues. Again, don't hold me to it. It's just kind of what I've picked up along the line, and my terminology might be wrong, but I'll come back to that. So here is, the piano's fallen asleep. Hang on, wake up. What I'm going to play you is a traditional scale, a diatonic scale, the kind of the same as the one I played on the harp. So it goes. Oh, there you go. Told you I wasn't a piano player. Nice do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, Julie Andrews type scale. So what's the difference? Well, the blues goes like this. The difference is you have sharps and flats. So this is all natural notes. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But then you got, that's a minor scale. Da, 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 da. So you flatten certain notes, and the notes that you flatten are the third note in the scale. So you got, but you go, and the fifth note in the scale, you go, and then you've got the seventh note in the scale. That's the seventh, the B. This is the C scale, and then you flatten it. So that's where you get it from, and then you get a chord like that. You've got a tension in the chord because you flattened one of the notes, whereas normally you would go, it's a major seventh and it's cool and it's jazz funk for the 1980s. So what's going on actually is when you're playing the blues, the band quite often is playing playing a major chord, but you're playing flattened notes over that major chord, and there's immediately that tension. And that's really the essence of the blues, is that tension. Now, there's a thing about blues and jazz. A lot of people say, well, the blues comes from New Orleans, doesn't it? And my answer is no, it doesn't. And also Bill Brunsey's answer, who's a much greater authority than I am, is no, it doesn't. I'm perhaps oversimplifying the discussion here, but there's a great album called Big Bill's Blues where he plays the blues on an acoustic guitar and talks about the difference between blues and jazz. And of course, Bill Brunsey was a great jazz guitar player, as well as being a very fine blues singer and composer. And he talks about jazz being born in the city, in New Orleans, so which came out again, the same sort of melting pot, but they're picking up piano. They've got pianos in the bars in New Orleans, so you've got that, you know. You need Justin Randall or, you know, someone like that to play proper blues piano, or New Orleans stride and all that kind of stuff. I can't do that. But you've got that, and you had brass instruments and that kind of stuff. They'd be, you know, and that's how trad jazz kind of came about. It had that tradition, and then they're bringing in the African stuff. But out in the, you know, so the jazz guitarists were the, it's kind of straighter. I can't help it. When I play anything, I sort of bend the note because I'm a blues man. But you've got that kind of straight, and you go. So it's kind of jazz. I'm not a jazz guitar player, but you can hear somewhere in there. You can hear the kind of Charlie Christian, Eddie Condon, early jazz guitar players, or any jazz guitar player. I mean, George Benson, Grant Green, all the great jazz players, they tend to play straight. They don't play a lot of bending notes because that's not what you did. But Bill Brunsey said, of course, the blues was born in the cotton fields. So instead of the compressed heat of the bars of New Orleans, you've got vast plains, huge skies, heat, dust, and dark nights, long, hard days in the field. And you sit at the end of the day and you cry, or you reach for something stronger. You cry to the Lord, or you cry for freedom, whatever it is you do. But what comes out is this. Now I'm going to demonstrate it on an electric guitar. But of course, in the early days, it would have been on acoustic, but it's just easier. So I have here my trusty Telecaster. If I'm not a piano player, I certainly ain't a guitar player. But this will give you the gist of it. So that you heard the jazz, the blues players, because they wanted to get the African scales going, quite often they would take a whiskey bottle or a beer bottle, whatever it would be, cut the neck off, file it down and smooth it off, and create a bottleneck, what was called a bottleneck and still is called a bottleneck. And it's a slide like that, and they've put it on the little finger or other fingers you can put it on, and then you can get the sliding. You can't really see on this, can you? You're sliding it on the strings. You don't press it down on the fretboard, you just let it ride along the strings. And immediately you've got much more space. You've got a much wider landscape there. And you've got, you can hear me vibrating the slide on the strings there. It's because the blues doesn't sit in any scale. The blues exists in the notes between the notes, for me at least. And that's why the piano is it's a difficult instrument to really play blues on, because you've got fixed notes. You can't bend that. You can on synthesizers and thing now, but it still doesn't work. So people like Herbie Hancock, they talk about how they put the flat and the sharp, the flat and the natural together to try and get it. And you often hear a blues player go, trying to get that bend going from the sharp to the natural. But on a guitar, you've got the real freedom. And also you can build a guitar. You can get some kind of, husk of something and stick a neck on it, stick a cord on it. They used to build things called diddly bows, where they'd nail a length of thread along the side of a shack and then weave the bottleneck along that. And that's where Bo Diddley gets his name from. But you can hear, something coming together now as they're starting to play guitars. They can buy them cheap from Sears Roebuck catalogues and stuff like that. And they're starting to bring out what they can do. Starting to get that rhythm going, and then you're in the juke joint on a Saturday night, or the fish fry, and everybody's gathered round, they're drinking whiskey, they're gambling out the back, and the guy's in the corner, or girl, or woman, or whatever, sitting in the corner, and maybe with a little band, and they're banging out a rhythm. Well, I woke up this morning feeling ran from a shoe. Didn't take too long, I had them walking blues. I woke up this morning feeling round from a shoe. Well, it didn't take me too long for I had them all walking blue. And so on and so forth, that kind of thing. And we'll come back to actually the electric guitar and all that kind of stuff later on in this little exploration of what was possible. So you start to get a sense of what's the essence of the blues. It's in that bend, it's in that space between the notes, because you've got that cry, like a human cry of pain or joy. You can, yeah, come on. You've got all that expressive power because you're breaking up fixed scales, you're breaking up rigid, repressed traditions like European. And you're suddenly going, no, come on, break free. There's much more you can play with. And out of all of that, out of those two things, the blues and jazz, out comes all of modern popular music. From Chuck Berry through to Metallica, and indeed the very excellent Mountain Caller. I suggest you look them up. And of course, being Henry's Black Sabbath, very much a blues band when they started out. So that's kind of the structure of the blues. There's the whole thing about the 12-bar blues, which perhaps I should say for a different time, but basically most blues follow the same pattern. They use three chords, the root chord in this case, C, and then they go to the 4 chord, F, and then back to C, and then they go back to the 5 chord, and then the 1, the 4, the 5. And most blues tunes use that combination. And it works in any other key as well. So the 1 in G would be G, and then the 4 becomes C, and the 5 becomes D, and back to G, the 1. That's how it varies, but you've got a formula then. So if you're in a blues band, you just say it's 1, 5, 4, in which case it's more like Key to the Highway, where you go from the 1 to the 5 to the 4. Or you go the 1, the 4 and the 5, and if you're halfway through a song you want to go to the 4, you just go 4, and everyone moves up to the 4, because of course, like all good musicians, they're all watching the singer and focused on what's going on, instead of looking off to the one side going, I don't know why I'm doing a drummer when I do that. So that's the blues structure. Some blues only have 1 chord, some blues have 2 chords. You can do what you like. That's the thing. Some musicians say it's boring, the blues, there's only 3 chords or 2 chords or 1 chord. Don't work with those musicians, because they're not bringing anything to the party. All they want to do is bang their instruments. They're like engineers. They're not actually musicians. A musician is somebody who expresses themselves through their playing. Anybody can learn to play an instrument. You can teach a monkey to play a piano if you take long enough. It's whether or not they express emotion through that. That's the difference. And the blues, because it's so simple, takes no prisoners. There's no room for anybody who just wants to be a passenger. You've either got to turn up and deliver, or don't bother, because nobody wants to hear you just banging your instrument. It's boring. So, how did we get to Henry's Blues Bar from a cotton plantation in Mississippi in the late 18th century, 19th century and 18th century? Well, there is a story, which may or may not be true, of how the blues came out of its little area, which was really condensed in the southern states, the cotton growing states, Mississippi, I can't remember, Alabama, places like that. And it concerns a man called Charles Handy. No, not Charles Handy. I've written Charles Handy here. It's W.C. Handy. Charles Handy is a very great industrial philosopher. W.C. Handy is claimed to be the father of the blues because he was the man who popularized it, essentially. And the story goes that for some reason he'd been touring the South, I think possibly looking for new tunes that he could bring back to the North, because he was based, I think, in Chicago or New York or somewhere. I told you not to trust me historically. And he was sitting on a platform in Tutwiler, Mississippi, waiting for a train, and he's sitting there, and I kind of picture him there all alone, and he's kind of hot and dry, and he's waiting for the train, and he's kind of sitting there and he's falling asleep. And then out of nowhere he hears something, and he hears a that kind of thing. We've already looked at it on the electric, because it would have been an acoustic. And he's never heard anything like this. So he's sitting there and he hears this, and he goes, and he looks up, and he looks around, and he sees a man further down the platform, sitting there holding his guitar, probably got a hat down, the classic stereotype of the blues. And he's sliding a slide, maybe a knife. Often they use the knife up and down the neck. And he's going, oh, I've never heard anything like this before. What does he do? Does he go and he doesn't want to stop? He doesn't want to stop him, so he waits. He's like David Attenborough watching a giraffe or something. And he's thinking, what's going on here? And his musical mind is hearing this strange sound and wondering how it fits into everything he's learned. And to his credit, he takes it, and there's the singer singing "Going Where the Southern Cross the Dog," and the Southern Railway and the Yellow Dog Railway. What was the Yellow Dog? Can't remember the name of it. Carolina, I think. But the names of the two railroads, and there was a junction, and the dream for lots of the sharecropping black people in the South was to get on a train and head north to Chicago, because there was, there weren't the Jim Crow laws, there was more money, there was better work, better accommodation, all that kind of stuff. This was around the time when the first migration began to happen from the South to the North. And Handy takes this song, calls it the Yellow Dog Blues, sheet music, sells it in shops, and people start performing it, and the blues starts to become a thing in the northern cities. And this is where you get the first kind of phase of the blues. I call it the Vaudeville Blues. It's probably not the right name, but it's in white theatres, if you like, quite a lot of it. And you've got people like Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, Victoria Spivey, the great women blues singers, and jazz singers, really. The blues and the jazz are kind of coming together because, of course, in cities like Chicago, King Oliver and Louis Armstrong are beginning to create what became the great trad jazz scene. So it's all coming together. And that's where the blues first began to get popular, if you like. Those kinds of performances. So you can see film of Bessie Smith singing the St. Louis Blues and that kind of stuff. And that was where, if you like, the idea of blues began to become known beyond the southern states. And what it moved into was things like the piano blues. So you'd have Leroy Carr, or check him out, a magnificent songwriter. I'll probably come back to him. And then there's boogie woogie, like Albert Ammons, Me Luck Lewis, Pete Johnson. I can't play boogie woogie, don't ask me to. and that kind of thing. So you had that kind of jazzy city blues coming out as a result of Handy's discovery of the music and making it popular. But meanwhile, down in the South, it's still being played on guitars and pipes and drums and as we'll find out in a minute, harmonicas. And there was the thing came up with the medicine shows traveling around the South, the Jug Bands. You've probably heard of the Memphis Jug Band, the Mississippi Sheiks. Jug bands were so called because the bass was a jug. Somebody had a jug. I can't do this either, but basically you into a jug and you make the noise you get a kind of a booming sound, and then they're banging banjos and they're playing harmonicas and often guitars and other things, and singing any kind of song, folk songs, reels and jigs, dances, anything that'll get the people going. And in between those things, spirituals, obviously, in between those things, they're playing what became known as the blues. They were known as reels, actually, and they were frowned upon. Lots of blues players will tell you stories of how when they first wanted to play, whoever was looking after them, if they were lucky, it was their parents. Often it might be a grandparent or whoever managed they finished up with, because, you know, the dad was in prison and mum was off with another man, or whatever the classic blues stories are. They would learn to play like the players they'd heard on the streets. They might hear Charlie Patton on the street singing songs, or Blind Lemon Jefferson if they were in Texas or somewhere like that. And they'd say, I want to play like that. So they'd try and play, and mum or grandma would come down, you can't play that music, it's the devil's music. Because this interval, this something like that, or the tritone, is that a tritone? Can't remember which one is which. Either way, that I think it's that one, is the devil's interval, because it's got a natural and a flat in it, and it's that's why the blues is called the devil's music, because it comes from here and you can't see down there, as opposed to up there. Spirituals come from on high. B.B. King said this, not me. Spirituals come from up there, the blues comes from down here, because the blues is about real life. It's not about the life to come, it's about what the hell is happening now. And so it got frowned upon, but that was the music that a lot of these young people wanted to play, because it was powerful, because it made an assertion, perhaps because the earlier generation frowned upon it. And of course, what's the job? It's the job of every young generation to upset the older generation. That's what they're for. So these jug bands would tour around and play that kind of music. And it was there that the great harmonica players first began to emerge. And there was a player with the Memphis Jug Band, a guy called Noah Lewis, who recorded an extraordinary instrumental piece called the Chickasaw Special. And it was a virtuoso performance. I can't do it, but I can give you a kind of an impression of it. Look, I'm out of practice, I can't do it, but if you listen to Chickasaw Special, you can find it online, you'll hear the definition of that. And it's a train, and it's bowling along, and then there's the whistle blows, and then there's a hound dog on the line. And that's from about 1923, a very early recording of blues harmonica, and it's as good as it ever got. You might as well just stop there. But that kind of virtuosity was coming, and there were lots of other good players as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the Marine Band was made popular by Matthias Hohner, a German harmonica manufacturer, who was the first to produce it on a large scale. He had a partner, his name escapes me, forgive me, gods of harmonica, who's kind of credited with actually inventing the harp. It's known as the blues harp, the harmonica. But it was Matthias who took it and manufactured it on a big scale and began to export it to America. It became available cheap through the Sears Roebuck catalogue and that kind of thing. The people in the South could start buying them, and that's how blues harp became part of it. And of course, the great thing about it, as you heard in that piece, is that you can bend. Just as you can slide on a guitar and you can't on a piano, you can bend on a harp, and you have to play a scale. But and the bend is what unlocks the blues on a harp. And I've got to try and tell you how you do it. But basically, to play the blues harmonica, you have to suck first and blow second. It took me a while. Somebody had to tell me, a guy, his name's gone straight out of my head. But Alex Spall in Sheringham in Norfolk. I've not seen him since. But he said to me, "You got to suck." And that was what unlocked the blues harp for me. So you go, normally you go, and that's folk music. But if you go, that's the blues, because you're drawing in and you've immediately got that seventh note that I was talking about. And this is a G harp, or a C harp. You got that without having to do anything. But what happens is your harmonica is tuned to the key of C. I don't know if that will come out. Just there on the plate. I don't know if you can see a little C engraved on it. So the scale here. That was clever, wasn't it? That's the scale. But of course, if I'm going to play the blues, I don't want to play the natural scale. So what I do is I take my C harp, which I blow a chord, but if I draw, it's tuned to G. Like that. So if I get the piano player to play in G, like that, then I can blow. And so on and so forth. And that's without bending, really. I accidentally did bend, I think, because you can't help it. But it's that easy. If you can blow or suck in a reasonable time, you can play the blues like that. So that's just suck, blow, suck, blow, suck, blow on the bottom few holes like that. Easy peasy. And then all you've got to do to get a bit more variety into it is bend some of the notes, because if I play without bending, the bottom scale, there's a couple of notes missing, so you have to go. And that's how you get, and then you start thinking, okay, so the challenge is to get a single note, as you can hear. I mean, obviously you just open your mouth and suck. But if you want a single note, you need to purse your lips a bit like that. It's not easy, actually. Well, it is easy, but it takes a bit of practice to get used to sort of only hitting one note at a time. Or you can do tongue blocking, where you put your tongue over the holes to the left of where you want to draw or the suck or blow, and then the only hole that's there is the one that you want to hit. So, and if you use tongue blocking, you get a bit more going for you, because you can then move your tongue and get some accompaniment going, or get some chords going, or octaves. So I'm blocking the middle holes, but drawing the holes either side. And the Shufflepack opening song, the standard song, is called Calling Card. It's like that, and you twiddle your tongue, and that's just drawing on a C harp, and you're getting a G octave. So you've got the whatever. But the other thing you can do is, if you block the holes, all the holes except the one you want, is move your tongue backwards and forwards, and you start to get an accompaniment. So, and Big Walter Horton, the great harp player, was a master of that, an amazing technician on the harp, as well as being a really, really beautiful blues player. I've probably used up my half an hour now, but I'm going to press on. Gosh, I'm 40 minutes in. I don't care. I'm going to keep going. We can edit it or something. I don't know. Okay, so that's kind of how you play the blues harmonica. To get the bend, you just need to sort of go out a bit. It's really a question of the shape of your mouth and how you feel your way through. But I kind of go. You kind of reduce the space. You put more pressure on the reed in the harmonica. And that kind of restricts the airflow a bit and bends the reed down further than it's supposed to go. I think it bends the very tip of the reed. The reeds vibrate freely in this chamber. You can't really see, but there's a brass plate on the top and a brass plate on the bottom in a marine band. And when you suck, if you suck, the ones on the top shut and the ones on the bottom vibrate, unless I've got it, I can't remember, it's probably the other way around, but I think it's the top shuts, and when you blow, the top vibrates and the bottom closes up. So when you're sucking a bit harder, the vibration intensifies and the tip of the reed bends a bit, and that's how you get the bent note, and eventually it bends and stays there because it's only brass and you can't expect it to live forever, and then you need a new heart. But they're cheap, so it doesn't matter. So that's kind of it in terms of the history of the blues harmonica, and roughly how to play it. Of course, how did people like Little Walter and Big Walter and Snooky Pryor, people like that, how did they get the sound that they got? Because this is just an acoustic sound. It's just me playing a harmonica. So in a country blues player like somebody like Sonny Terry, that's what you'd hear, but I mean, you'd still get a great tone. And obviously Noah Lewis. Noah Lewis sounds crunchy on the recordings because the recording's bad, not because he's amplified or anything like that. So you get Sonny Terry. That kind of Fox Chasey thing that Charlie McCoy took and eventually made his other. That kind of stuff. And that was the kind of the traditional country blues. But when the blues moved from the south to the north, or people started migrating, especially in the 30s, during the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl time, people moved up to Chicago to work in the factories there, and the New Deal and everything was opening up there. Suddenly the guitarists, as we heard earlier, they're banging out loud music through amplifiers. And just generally the clubs are noisier than the bars, and there's pianos in there making a lot of noise. Oh, my essential rocket fuel is falling now. Blues and whiskey go together. Johnny Walker Red Label, immortalised in a number of different songs. So what the great blues players did, and Little Walter usually gets the credit for this, but there's a lot of discussion about who it was. Jim Simpson claims it was Snooky Pryor, and it might have been. I figure it might be Walter Horton. I don't know. But somebody decided to pick up the vocal mic and start playing the harmonica through it. So you suddenly got... and you've got a whole different sound. Little Walter said he wanted to play the saxophone. Couldn't afford a saxophone. Bought himself actually a chromatic harp, which I meant to have an example of and forgot. Much bigger than this. It's got a slider on it. It's got all the notes on it instead of just the simple 10 notes or 10 holes that you've got on this, however many notes that is. And so that's why he's hailed as such an innovator, because he was trying to push the harp beyond the limits that most ordinary harp players didn't want to go, because he was trying to play it like a saxophone. And then you get this huge amplified sound. It's a little pig nose amp. There's no reverberation on it, so you don't get that booming sound that Walter had. But you do get all that kind of juke in there somewhere. And it's the wrong key, but it's the right song. And all that kind of stuff. Which is Hoochie Coochie Man. Actually, that was played in first position, so... second position, I can't remember how to play it in... That's it. So anyway, first position is when you blow. So the thing about playing Hoochie Coochie Man, harp players, if you're wondering how he does it, he's playing in first position. So you start with a draw on the second hole. And he plays it on an A harmonica instead of the C that I'm playing on. Anyway, I digress. But you hear the sound. It's just a simple microphone. This is my trusty Bayer that I've had for about 30 years. Straight through an amplifier. People tear themselves in knots trying to get a great sound with a blues harp. I tried for a long time buying different amps, all kinds of pedals and all kinds of stuff. And then I realised, how did Little Walter do it? Little Walter just grabbed whatever was available. And the reason it sounded the way it sounded was because the equipment wasn't very good. So I bought not very good equipment and sounded great. I was really well pleased with it. And this mic is a bit knackered now, so I get a bit of a crunch out of it. And you just got to amplify your natural sound. You just make your sound louder. If it doesn't sound good here, it won't sound good here. So yeah, that's the how the harp became the Chicago blues harp instead of just the blues harp. Just made it louder with bad gear. So I've overrun by a considerable amount. I'm going to pause here and say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the history of the blues and how to play blues harmonica. I've probably missed out a load of good stuff. I was going to talk more about the actual history of the blues and bring it from where we got to, which was kind of Chicago and the early great blues singers like Bessie Smith and so on, and start looking at the history of the Chicago blues in the 50s and how it became the worldwide phenomenon that it is now. So I'll pause there and maybe do another version of this where I talk about that, and we can do that some other time. In the meantime, Henry's Blues fans, I hope you're all safe and well, and I hope that very soon we'll be back at Henry's itself, rocking the joint and having a great time. In the meantime, with any luck and a following wind, Joe and I have put together a special version of a new song, especially for this lockdown time. And with any luck, there'll be some Shufflepack clips to follow this as well. In the meantime, thanks Jim, thanks Nick and everyone at Big Bear. Thanks to everyone who supports the blues by coming out to Henry's every week. And we'll see you for real very soon. You know, if you was my girl, I'd tell you what I would do. I would give you